I'm Anne McElvoy from the Economist. I'm your timekeeper and director of traffic this morning of the first panel. The UK maker or taker is our headline thought. Does the UK get more out of the EU than it puts in, or vice versa? Or is it in some wonderful celestial balance in which everything is as good as it could possibly be, and we're just making an awful lot of fuss about nothing? It is possible that the latter thought is true, but whichever way, we have seen the EU come back to political salience, perhaps in a way that many people would not have predicted in the 1990s, when the Maastricht Treaty and the aftermath caused such reverberations in British politics. I think starting to come to politics around that time, it was very much a feeling. I think some of my first stories were usually something about John Major at Bay, and the broken heart of Europe. I think there was generally a feeling towards the end of that time that perhaps this was going to be something that might go into abeyance for a while. Well, it is certainly back with a vengeance in this referendum year. So here we are with an illustrious panel to separate the signal from the referendum noise.
Thank you very much, Anne. Well, thank you to the organisers, and as Anne said, I'm down to speak, and the title's an interesting one because it encapsulates what I think is wrong. Britain's entry into the European community is a huge mistake. The main problems, I think, with all of this are historical, and one of them is that, of course, Britain didn't enter the EU, it entered something called the common market. Now, it's a theme I'll come back to, but I think it's indicative of part of the problem, that, as it were, we now talk about the EU back when we talked about the common market. I think there are two senses in which history is a problem, and one of them is to do with England's history, not Great Britain. The problem with the EU, Euroscepticism, is not a UK-wide phenomenon, as UKIP found out at the last election. It's largely an English problem. That's not surprising. England, as a state, dates back to about the 7th century, and despite rhetoric about successive waves of immigration, geneticists have tended to show that about something over 90% of the UK gene pool comes from about the same place and has been here since before then. The Romans and the Normans genetically have left little trace. England has a history of expansion and success. She has not, on the whole, suffered the trauma that most of the other states in Europe have done. She's a longer creation, and unlike France, which is perhaps the other long creation, she hasn't suffered heavy defeats and been made to wonder about her security. So all of that gives, if you like, a different resonance historically for the English. This, I think, in terms of creating the problem we're talking about, was exacerbated by what I would call the original sin around the negotiations. What I mean by the original sin is that back in the 60s and 70s, late 50s indeed, a huge emphasis in all the argumentation was placed on an economic cooperation, on a common market. Very little, if anything, was said about a federal agenda. And I think those negotiations and that attitude is the product of a particular time and place. At the beginning of all of this, there is what historians have taken to calling declinology. The idea that the British ruling elite at that time is committed, if you like, to managing decline. The Atlantic Alliance, whilst it had secured our security in the world, while it had enabled British prime ministers to pretend they were still a great power, had not done anything about the economic problems. The answer to this was, we were told, the common market. The British public is sold the idea of a common market as an answer to its economic difficulties. It's a means, true, of avoiding wars in Europe, and to a generation that had been shaped partly by the austerity of the 30s and by the two wars in Europe, which feared affluence was about to give way to further austerity, this was a very attractive message. There's actually nothing wrong with an elite project to create a federal Europe. It may indeed have much to recommend it. It would have been nice if someone had told us what those things were, when we were going into the European Common Market, and it would be terribly nice if they explained it to us during the referendum campaign. Then it would be quite nice if they do it now. But if it is not mentioned, then people do not actually get the idea, do not get a chance to buy into it. In fact, what they get the impression of, and if they only had a vague impression, the antis will certainly reinforce it, which is that they have been lied to. Something is going on here. Now, there's another difficulty here with the way in which our politics has developed. Our own government, conscious of this and of the failure of the EU to take what I would call an emotional route in the country, is doing what Harold Wilson did, pursuing a quest that is worthy of what's just down the way with the Anglican Communion, trying to find a middle way where nobody really thinks one exists. Best of luck to them with that. And it is a peculiar thing indeed that despite the billions of pounds and the good that the EU has done and continues to do, it is odd that despite the millions of pounds that have been spent and will be spent on persuading us all that the EU is wonderful, that there is no demotic support for it. It remains primarily a cause for elites amongst academics, the commentariat, the political classes. And nobody is making, and I wish they would, a convincing high-level visionary narrative for what the EU is and why we should stay there. Simply trying to frighten the electorate that we must hang on to nurse for fear of finding something worse risks, I think, repeating the original sin mistake. Europe has actually always been about a vision of what might be. And I think it would be better, even at this late hour, assuming, of course...
It is a late hour, by the way.
It is. Those who believe in Europe, if those who still believe in Europe would like to sell it via the high road, not the low road. So it would be rather nice, amidst all the facts and figures, to have a convincing narrative that might just persuade people. Thank you.
Take the high road, was John's advice, but we have been gulled, we've been misled by a project engineered by elites. Let's hold that thought as we turn to Piers, Ludlow.
I'll start with the addition, namely that actually I just don't buy this idea that of what John is describing as the original sin. I've slogged through a lot of those original speeches and debates in the 1960s and 1970s. Indeed, I had rather a surprise when I undertook for a conference in California to write a piece about the original British parliamentary debates, the ones in October 71, about the what became the European Communities Bill. And I thought, okay, I could read the debate in a couple of days. I hadn't realised that this was 6 days of continuous parliamentary debate of goodness knows how many thousand words, and it took me a long time to slog through it. If you can't see politics in that debate, you really must be very, very myopic indeed. It's absolutely everywhere, both on the antis and on the pros side. So the idea that this was systematically concealed is, I'm afraid, something that just doesn't wash. I think it's important, having now spent over 4 decades of experiencing the difficulties and the discomforts of life inside the European community, then the European Union, briefly to recall how uncomfortable life on the margins of that entity was. Because the period that stretched from 1958 to 1975, in other words, those years when Britain was on the outside looking in, was not a particularly happy phase at all. In the process of not negotiating, in other words, in those years where Britain just simply coexisted with the EC on its doorstep, this too was deeply uncomfortable. The European community is an intensely unresponsive body when it comes to requests from outsiders for its policies in any sense altered or varied on the behest of outsiders. And in international negotiations, the most famous of which in the 1960s was the Kennedy round of GATT. This is the predecessor of the World Trade Organization. The Kennedy round was one of the big commercial negotiations of the 1960s, and this was a profoundly discomforting experience for the British, because they basically discovered that the final stages of the Kennedy round became a dialogue between the United States and the EC, with absolutely no room or influence left for the British and other Europeans who weren't inside the EC. It always has been a deeply divisive debate, but it's a bizarre debate because it's polarising in two different ways. It's polarising between the antis and the pros, in a sense, in the way that you might expect. So there have always been people who are passionately committed against and passionately committed for. In a sense, that's not unusual. But what I think is surprising about the European debate is the way in which the polarisation actually goes between those for whom this is an important issue and those for whom it is a matter of profound indifference. And this is not actually, although it sometimes has elements of this is not simply an elite versus general population debate. Actually, within the political elite, there have always been many for whom this is a profoundly boring, dull, uninteresting issue, whereas there have been others for whom this has been an existential question, whether you're pro or anti. And I think this same divide between indifference and those for whom this is passionately important was there in the 1960s and is there. It was being mocked on the news quiz last Friday when I was listening at home last Friday evening. Exactly the same thing about how boring this all is. There is still a substantial part of the elite, whether it be the political elite, journalistic, business, academia, etc., for whom this is not an interesting issue. My wife and I reckon we can spoil virtually any dinner party because I know about Europe and she knows about religion. The fact that the process that led Britain to membership was extremely bumpy and took much longer than anybody had anticipated or expected, that is not just a distant bit of history that has had no repercussions. It is actually something that profoundly shapes the whole British European experience. When Britain joined in 1973, the fact that it was joining at least a decade later than it had expected to join greatly lessens its ability to shape the community in its fashion. In the early 1960s, a lot about the European community was still malleable. By the time you get to the early 1970s, a lot more is set in stone. These are policies that are basically shaped in the period when Britain is on the margins but had expected to be inside. Second point about the delay, about the repercussions, the legacy of the delay, is that joining in 1973 is just about the worst possible time you could join, because it is, of course, the start of the first global recession after the Second World War. Now, I don't think there's actually very much connection between between Britain's economic travails during the 1970s and European Community membership, but the coincidence of timing creates a very strong contrast between the British experience of membership with that of the founder members. Actually, the British had always expected that by joining the ECE, this was the assumption of Heath, of Macmillan, of Wilson, of all of the British leaders in the 60s who contemplated entry, was that by joining they would immediately become one of the leaders, if not the single leader of the European community. In many ways that doesn't happen.
Now, Stephen Wall, you've dealt with this very much at the coalface of diplomacy, but you also have this very valuable perspective for us today of being the official historian of the UK and the European Union. And your presentation is entitled Looking Back from Heath to Blair, and I would like you to do that, and then perhaps at the end you might point us forward from Blair to where we are now.
The kind of European community that the UK wanted and wants has always been, when I say the UK, I mean successive British governments, has always been one which is fundamentally intergovernmental and fundamentally run, as Piers was saying, by Britain, France and Germany. Even Ted Heath. I was rather surprised when I was doing the official history. If you look at the documents, Ted Heath had complete disregard for the European Commission, total disregard for the European Parliament. One of the reasons why he signed up so readily to one of the conditions of British membership set by President Pompidou, namely British acceptance of the Luxembourg Compromise, was because to him, and indeed to Pompidou and also to Willy Brandt, it was inconceivable that any of the large member states could be overturned on an issue of real importance. The financing of the European community had been set in advance of the negotiation, and it included the common agricultural policy, then taking 75% of the budget, and from which Britain got very little benefit, and therefore screwing us with a financing deal, which made the relationship controversial from the start. Piers touched on that, 1973, the so-called Year of Europe. And interestingly, and again it's a reflection on Heath, the most pro-European Prime Minister, Ted Heath's last instruction to Alec Douglas-Home on the eve of what turned out to be a disastrous general election in February 1974 was to block any attempt at an energy union very necessary after the Arab oil boycott following the Yom Kippur War, to block all of that until Britain got satisfaction on the structural funds, which were then seen as the principal means by which Britain might redress the raw financial deal that it's got. We were then very quickly, towards the end of the 80s, into the run-up to economic and monetary union, which appeared to entrench a sort of fundamental division between Britain and the rest of our partners. I think it is questionable whether that is in fact what happened. Those of our partners who have argued that the European Union would have been much more successfully integrationist had it not been for Britain as the backmarker, seems to me have to confront the fact that the Treaty on Economic and Monetary Union was made without us. It was made by those who were being allowed by the British opt-out to create a European Economic and Monetary Union in their own image and likeness, and in fact what they ducked, and this is what we're seeing today, what they ducked was the issue which, as Margaret Thatcher described it, she said, you can only have a successful economic and monetary union if you have fiscal transfers between rich and poor. You can only have fiscal transfers between rich and poor if you conduct yourself as you would conduct yourself within a nation state, i.e. on the basis of a real political union. And as we've seen, that argument remains unresolved. So much for that kind of take aspect. What about the make aspect? If you turn over the coin, I mean, de Gaulle, it seems to me, was right. De Gaulle was right in predicting that British accession would fundamentally change the nature of the European community. It would make it more Atlanticist, more outward-looking. It would enlarge. De Gaulle, uniquely at the time, foresaw enlargement to up to 18. Without Callanan and Thatcher, would there have been the CAP reform that took place in the 1980s? Questionable. Without Thatcher, would there have been the single market? After all, very, very little had happened to create a single market for the first 30 years of the existence of the European community until the Thatcher government. Would enlargement have happened on the scale that it happened? Tony Blair's approach was strictly intergovernmental. He had very little regard for the European Commission. I remember coming away from a meeting with the European Parliament where he'd done a blinder in addressing the European Parliament. We got in the car and Tony Blair turned to me and said, well, that's enough of that bollocks. We are, I think, the only member state for whom this issue remains an existential issue. And that, I think, does come back to a uniquely British view of sovereignty, rooted around, even today, rooted around the importance of the national parliament in our life. I used to remind my colleagues in Brussels at a time when majority voting for tax issues was very much on the agenda. I used to remind my colleagues in Brussels that we had, in Britain, after all, Parliament had cut the head off the king in order to assert Parliament's rights over taxation. And that issue seems to me to remain fundamental and visceral.
Is there a bit of an analogy with people who say, you know, what's the trouble with immigration? We've never been told what it's really about, but often they mean as if we told them they'd like it even less.
I can see why that might look like that. What I think I was suggesting was that it is because of, and Sim mentioned some of the exceptional nature of English-British history. It is precisely those things that required, I think, a different approach. And I take entirely Piers's point about what happened in Parliament. I think that overestimates the amount of interest that people who did not read the parliamentary reports, and I don't know how many of them there were, but of course Parliament was not then televised, and even now it is. It doesn't exactly get a marvellous audience. So, I mean, again, I think, you know, there's no doubt that amongst the political elite these things were hammered out. The unfortunate thing is it does not seem to me that translated itself into public discourse. And if it did, why is it not there? What is it that keeps Britain in this strange, agonised... I mean, both Michael's absolutely right. no other European country has this kind of existential angst. And it does seem to me that the existential angst requires both explaining, and if there is anything to the line I'm taking, then I think going back to a set of bang you on the head with, it'll be very jolly unpleasant if we leave, it may work again, but it won't actually deal with the lack of what one might call a love deficit.
What would deal with a love deficit? Or is that the right way to think about this? Stephen, you look like a loving sort.
Well, what I think is interesting, it picks up on what John was saying earlier, is that when George Brown, the Labour Foreign Secretary, presented publicly the case for British membership, it was very much the political case that they made. And Wilson always said, because the balance of trade was the big issue at the time, that the economic arguments were finally balanced. Margaret Thatcher, I've just been looking at the papers, 84 papers, just the other day. In conversation with her European colleagues, Margaret Thatcher was saying in 1984, I am a passionate European. I am a passionate European because I believe in Europe for peace and the spread of democracy. Now, of course, some of that argument now looks as if the war is gone, enlargement has happened, etc., etc. But I do think we have to go beyond the economic arguments. There has to be what I call the moral argument for Europe, if you like.
Yeah. But I think this does in a sense go to the heart of the problem, in that I don't think there was a failure to talk about the kind of higher ambitions, I think it was just a lack of interest. So I've looked at systematically, sort of tried to study the way in which Europe was sold or not sold from 61 right the way through to the 75 referendum. There is plenty of stuff there about politics if you look, but I take John's point, people don't read Hansard. People don't go the press coverage was, I think, rather better in those days of what Parliament was saying, but you still would have to read the Times or a broadsheet in order to get a lot of real flavour of these speeches. And obviously many people did not do that. But there was a sort of certain sense that you get in the 60s, I think you get still more in 75, that the political elite wants to talk about this as either an anathema, a total threat to everything that the British hold dear in terms of parliamentary sovereignty, or the only way in which Britain can sort out its problem and its position in the world. And yet people keep on coming back to what's this going to happen, what's the effect going to be on food prices. And one of the great things in the 75 referendum became this gimmicky business of sort of how much, in very sexist terms, a housewife's shopping basket would cost if Britain were a member of the community and if Britain were by contrast, in EFTA. And various stunts where people were sent off, housewives were sent off to Sweden to do their shopping to see whether they spend more or less, which is all very gimmicky and silly, but it did actually reflect the level which most people seem to want to engage. And I have no answer as to why this is the case.
I think also, if you look at the pamphlet which the No campaign put out to all households in 75, it very much overstates the case, because it is basically saying, look, vote yes and Britain will disappear as a single country. We should be absorbed into something which clearly wasn't going to happen.
I would like you all perhaps to fast forward just probably the last round before we throw this open. Negotiation/renegotiation. Piers, I'll come to you because you started us off on this track. Now, we've got one narrative of the present renegotiation which says it's all a load of rubbish really, and it's window dressing. Cameron needs to at least pretend that it's happening. You hear that both from the right and the left in the argument. But there's another one which seems to say, well, there's quite a lot going on in this renegotiation. I mean, something seems to have moved a small amount on benefit entitlement. Possibly the Eurozone and our relationship to the Eurozone will be clarified, and we might even find that the justice and sovereignty is in some last minute a shiny rabbit of some description could be pulled from that hat. That seems to be the expectation, at least, of some more sceptically inclined in cabinet that I've spoken to. So what is being achieved in renegotiation now? We've got a pithy round on this, I think. Piers?
Well, I tend to be on the side, tend to look sort of historically at the 75 referendum as a little bit of a smoke and mirrors trick, not very much change. On the other hand, the EC, EU, and this is again sort of goes back to my first point about the discomforts of life on the outside, it is an entity which has always been very good at coming up with at least cosmetic solutions for insiders' problems. And so something will be devised. How substantive it will be, whether it will fundamentally address the discomforts of Britain's existence within the EU, whether it will begin to address some of the more fundamental points that
Are you
John
going to place your bet as to what it is? I'd just like to have
but I just
opinion.
don't, something, a deal will be done, almost certainly. Whether that will really change anything fundamental, I think, is much, much more open to doubt.
I think that the nearest analogy I can think of is that I think they're one stage back from what's happening at Canterbury at the moment with the Anglicans probably finally not finding a fudge. I don't think we're yet at the stage that the Anglicans are where you can't find a way through. I think that Mr. Cameron, it seems to me, is often underrated by his critics. It seems to me that he's actually quite good at politics. And then I fear there will be an awful lot of economics. And that's why I would just like some vision, because I genuinely think there's something there.
Right, in fairness, Mr. Cameron, you didn't really ever want to embark on this, did you? So, Stephen, if you were on the inside of this, would you be happy with the way this renegotiation was going?
Well, I think what we will get is what we now see. I'd be surprised if there is some, very surprised if there's some new rabbit out of hat. In '75, Wilson got a deal on the British budget position, which never actually delivered. But he established the principle that there was an issue that had to be addressed. Cameron has made a debate about freedom of movement in one form or another semi-respectable, and of course because everybody else in Europe has a problem in spades in terms of the influx. That dynamic, I think, will not kind of disappear. It will be an ongoing issue. The key issue, it seems to me, is the relationship between ins and outs in terms of the Eurozone. And it's clear that Cameron will not achieve, or George Osborne will not achieve for Britain any kind of veto on the praise of the Eurozone. But again, he will put down some markers, and maybe a bit more than markers, which will give us something to work on for the future. But for two generations basically who have only known for Britain a peace basically, I think getting into your head the idea that we actually live in a dangerous world, and therefore that having a close relationship with your geographical neighbours who share your same values and are forced by European law to share your same values, and to have policies that then spread those values insofar as you can around the world. I think getting into our own heads that actually is important for our security.
There is also, of course, the fact that in America, if one looks at reading a book recently about the American Revolt, which was making a very good point, that actually an awful lot of it is to do with a resentment against parliamentary regulation, and at the beginning there's an appeal to George III to overrule Parliament. So it is up and down, and there are times when the British resent and want to be able to vote out people who pass legislation like this, and they can't do it with the European Commission.
And can I just make one of the things I think is most striking about our history is the extent to which this has been, for all political leaders, a real issue of party management. Yes. Under Harold Macmillan, Ian MacLeod, the party chairman, saying we've got a real problem convincing our own people and the country. In 1970, the election of elected Heath, quite a few Conservative candidates stood on anti-European platforms. Enoch Powell believed that by leading the revolt against Europe, he could unseat Heath as Prime Minister. Wilson, we saw, the only Prime Minister who hasn't had that problem. Margaret Thatcher had that problem. Major had it in spades. The only Prime Minister who hasn't had that problem, and sadly didn't take advantage of the fact, partly because he had a separate problem, which was Gordon Brown, was Tony Blair.
Just on the deregulation issue, I was aware of this initiative, but it must be said that previous commissions have also said the same thing, so to a certain extent the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, and the point that you raise about the need for certain regulations being sort of in a sense inescapable is an important one. On the muddling through, I would agree. I think sort of, if the vote is no, I think it will change a certain amount, but it will immediately start a complicated, messy, very muddled negotiation.
If the referendum votes for us to stay, it will continue to be a pain in the ass, albeit a productive pain in the ass for our partners. I don't myself buy the scenario that this will be like Ireland or Denmark, because their they were blocking something that could only happen if their agreement was given. I think what is possible if we voted to come out, I think, is that as the 2-year or more denegotiation process came underway, I think it is perfectly possible that people in Britain would start to think to themselves, oh my God, why did nobody tell us?
Thank you very much to my panel, to John Piers and Steve. You give me a round of applause. Thank you.